Hi, my name is Brian Venton, and today I want to talk about the concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood cities that we're starting to hear a lot more about in Australia. And I want to give some background context and then look at Townsville itself and then consider a local response. But first, some background context. The World Economic Forum is embedded in Australian politics, and I never quite realised how embedded they were until I saw a video of our former PM, Scott Morrison, being interviewed by the World Economic Forum. And seeing that interview surprised me significantly and started to make me ask a lot of questions. Now, secondly, the smart cities idea is a product of the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, and they are tied in with Agenda 30, which is and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or what's called SDGs. Now, the Agenda 2030 plan was formalised in 2015 and adopted by the UN, and all member countries as signatories, including Australia, were obliged to adopt all of the SDGs. Now, most people don't realise this, but the Australian government's coordination and implementation of Agenda 2030 is led by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet itself. Now, soon after the SDGs were launched by the UN, Australia produced its first voluntary national review, it was called the VNR, of how Australia planned to implement the SDGs. And it was launched in June 2018 by the Honourable Julie Bishop, when she was Minister for Foreign Affairs, and was delivered the next month to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. Now, you can see from this very brief overview that Australia, irrespective of any political persuasion, is up to its neck in this global agenda and more embedded than most of us probably realise. Now, let's look at the Townsville context. Back in 2021, the Intelligent Community Forum, which is an international think tank driving community change, recognised Townsville as one of 21 top global smart cities, along with Newcastle and Melbourne in that year. In fact, Townsville is again being listed in 2023 for recognition, along with Geelong and the Sunshine Coast this time. For this recognition to be occurring, action has been on the go for many, many years. Townsville Council formally gave the green light to the 20-minute smart concept in October 2018, not long after the VNR was first enacted by Julie Bishop. That was when Council officially approved what is called the Smart Townsville Community Partnership Policy, and we'll look at this a little bit more closely in a moment. In my view, though, the smart city concept, and particularly the 20-minute component of smart cities, have been conveniently obscured from public knowledge. They were kept obscure in all of our federal elections, both in 2019 and 22, and we've also to date heard nothing about them in state elections, although Victoria, it's to be noted, in 2019 did start running some pilot programs that were working models, and were working on models as early as 2016. I suspect that the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods won't be discussed in the New South Wales election period until after next weekend, and also in Queensland until probably after our local elections in March next year, and probably not until after the Queensland state election later in 2024 in October. Now, why the obscurity? Well, I suggest they don't really want to rock the boat and alarm people, especially with the 20-minute neighbourhood aspect of the smart cities. Our job is to start rocking the boat a bit and make people aware of what is happening and how they will be impacted. Now, in Townsville, there are layers of interconnected organisations, both local and international, that drive the 2030 agenda. The narrative and the messaging, however, is closely controlled and easily shut down by a dominantly partisan council, and progress unhindered in line with internal agendas. Now, partisan politics is invariably an enabler to drive partisan outcomes, and that's what's happening in Townsville. If you have unfettered control over process like Townsville Council has, and for that matter many other councils throughout Australia, then you can do almost what you want at will at a local level without much pushback. Now, local organisations here in Townsville include the Smart Precinct NQ, which was set up by 5 North Queensland mayors in conjunction with input from our local university, JCU. And this compact includes Townsville, Burdekin, Charters Towers, Palm Island and Hinchinbrook councils, and you can read about it online. Then there is the Intelligent Community Forum, which is the global network of collaboration between councils that I referred to a moment earlier. Then there are organisations like C40 Network, which is over 100 councils globally, and also the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which already has 30 Australian councils and cities aligned with it. Then there is the Townsville City Deal. Now that's a 15-year deal signed back in 2016, which runs right through to 2031. It was the first deal of its kind formed and is a compact between the federal government, state government and local council, and it also drives the smart city agenda in our local context. Now this deal is what is pumping millions of infrastructure dollars into our region. Then you'll have a body called the Townsville Future Cities, which is a council body. It was set up in 2011 and has driven much of the smart city concept, both in its early days and in its current circumstance. Now the Smart Townsville Community Partnership mentioned before is a key explanatory document, and follow the thread as I briefly look at it and see where we end up. And you can access this publication online. The publication proposes 5 core pillars. 1, delivering an open and engaged council, implementing a citizen-centric council. The terms open, engaged and citizen-centric are a bit of a misnomer in my view. We're expected to believe council is collaborative, but narratives are controlled and any dissenting voices can be easily excluded by a partisan council. Then the 3rd pillar, facilitating innovation and entrepreneurship and economic development. But look at point 4, focusing on placemaking and livability. Now that caught my eye and made me ask, what does that really mean? And we will look at it a little bit closer in a moment. Then the 5th pillar is delivering best practice infrastructure and asset management. So point 4, focusing on placemaking and livability, and it covers 6 areas, and I want to look at them now. Supporting art and cultural development, and includes things like stadium, V8, Strand Pool, Kids Water Park, Dazim Barracks, the Aquatic Museum, rebuild, etc. And I suggest keeping people socially serviced is an important dynamic for 20-minute neighbourhoods to actually function in our area. Then second, create accessible, digitally connected, vibrant and safe precincts. Now that's quite loaded, it's a loaded statement. It makes use of everything AI and camera surveillance technologies. As of December 22 last year, you may not realise this, but there are 537 cameras that have been installed locally around Townsville. Now we're told they are for infrastructure, to monitor infrastructure, but they also state in their documentation that they are for public safety as a secondary purpose. Now you can imagine where that might lead to. Then thirdly, they want to improve access to real-time journey planning for public transport. That's an interesting phrase as well. It's very important, I suggest, to have well thought through transport systems for a 20-minute neighbourhood to function effectively. The goal is to reduce our carbon footprint in the name of a climate emergency and reduce our vehicular use by 50% by 2030. But there's more. They want to improve data collection relating to event attendance to support future design, implementation and decision making. Often this starts in a socially acceptable way, but could easily be morphed into other purposes that we are currently not aware of. Then 5, develop a Townsville barometer, and you can see that actually operating. It's called the Townsville dashboard, which you can look up as well. And finally, and note this, the goal is to establish Townsville as a 20-minute city. That is the stated objective for Townsville. It's in black and white. But note though, at the moment you can't find anything specific on what constitutes a 20-minute city. Nothing on any council website is easily identifiable. Perhaps because council elections are coming up in 12 months' time and they don't want to kind of stir up the waters too much. Perhaps because they're still thinking through the logistics, and I suggest there's a lot of logistics to be thought through for regional implementation of 20-minute neighbourhoods. Perhaps because they're wanting to get all the infrastructure completed first. Perhaps because we just haven't looked hard enough to find where their plans are and what their plans are. There is, though, another document titled The Livable Strategy 2020 to 24, which has a lot of 20-minute neighbourhood ideas embedded in it, but without actually mentioning the words. So now let's consider a response to all of this that we can take locally. What can we do to make a difference? And I want to suggest 6 responses or pathways forward. First, we now have a policy model being rolled out in Victoria that potentially will set a national precedent for other jurisdictions throughout Australia. Now, I suggest that that's a good thing because at least we know the shape of what is planned or could be implemented across the country out of Victoria. Now, can you imagine, though, being confined to live in an 800-metre radius living zone? They argue that they have no intention to restrict movement, but international documentation and lived experience overseas indicates very differently. Now, secondly, it means that pushback is occurring worldwide, particularly once people began to notice what was happening in Oxford in the United Kingdom. And we can learn from the approach that others are taking and draw down on those reference points for our own local circumstance. And third, and this is a little bit different, and something you may not have thought about, and I would argue that the 20-minute city is a moral issue, and it's not a political one. Now let me flesh this idea out for you a bit. There is a fair bit here to understand, but I think it's important to make this point. In 1991, James Hunter wrote a book called The Culture Wars for what he saw playing out in America's fights over abortion, gay rights and religion in public schools. And since then, of course, a lot more has been happening globally in the whole culture wars scenario. But Hunter made a very pertinent observation back then, it's a long time ago, about the difference he saw between political issues and the culture war fights when he said this. He says, on political matters, one can compromise, but on matters of ultimate moral truth, one cannot. Now, my argument is that we should not view smart cities nor the 20-minute neighbourhood aspect to them so much as a political issue, but as a moral one. Now, why is that? It is a moral issue because we are being told how we are expected to live. And if you read the documentation, a choice has already been made for us by others, telling us what is best for us, and we are expected to comply and all line up in agreement. Now let me illustrate from one part of the Victorian legislation. In Victoria, they argue if they can reduce vehicular usage by 50% by eliminating short trips, then they will save perhaps $160 million on their state budget. But on the surface, that sounds like a great idea as a political argument, but the issue is really a moral one. They really want to limit your ability to move and control your goings and comings because we're facing a catastrophic climate emergency if we don't keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. That's the real motivation here. I'm inclined to think that the climate emergency legislation introduced both in Northern Territory, Victoria and South Australia will at some point be used to enforce control of movement in our lives. The 20-minute city is about changing the way we do things to live in zones where everything we need is within a walk to and from your home in an 800-metre radius of where we live. They will never declare this openly because the public won't buy it, but the secret is getting out and people are becoming very aware of broader intent. So when Klaus Schwab says you will own nothing and be happy, that is a moral statement. It's not a political one. Or when Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister back in 07, said that climate change is the greatest moral challenge we will face in our generation, that too was a moral statement. It's not a political one. And when Prime Minister Rudd used the word moral, that was the day I really started to wake up about climate and politics, and look where all that has brought us to today. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't need Klaus Schwab or Kevin Rudd or Scott Morrison, Albo, or Dan Andrews, or any local mayor for that matter, to define for me, let alone determine for me, what will make me happy. And that's the issue. It does mean that we should ask some questions though. What are you and I prepared to accept as morally appropriate for our lives? What constitutes a line in the sand for you and for me where you can articulate a moral position statement on the rightness or the wrongness of a 20-minute neighbourhood and how it affects your life and my life and those around you? As a strategy, I suggest we need to argue our case more from a moral basis. And the better we do that, the better will be our impact in getting people on side. Now, let me make a suggestion. As you read and research any documentation, do so through the filter of a moral looking glass. Try and understand what is being said in terms of right and wrong, and then try and articulate a case that resonates with the community about why a course of action might be inappropriate for your community. Now, this leads me to the next point, the fourth point. Try and discern who and what are the key drivers behind any issue and join all the appropriate dots. Be a researcher and an investigative journalist. Often there's a dot here and a dot there and a dot on another page, and try and relate the normally unrelated. Read between the lines and try and discern what is not being said as much as what is being said. Now, Kate Mason recently put an excellent video together. It's very good, and she makes some very pertinent points about our approach to pushing back on smart cities. And I suggest you look her up, go to one of our Facebook pages and listen to it. They're out there. Maria Z from Z Media also put a very good one out a couple of weeks ago, which comes at it from another angle. But the fifth response, the fifth pathway forward. Council elections are coming up in March 2024. Back in 2020, Mayor incumbent Jenny Hill declared that Team Hill looked like doing a clean sweep of all the councillors in Townsville. As it turned out, one independent, Susan Blom from Division 2, got elected, and then when Les Walker went to Brisbane as an MP in the state election, Fran O'Callaghan won Division 10 as an independent, and that was quite a surprise. So Team Hill has 9 councillors in their voting block in council, and independents too. And it seems to be a pattern across Australia that anyone standing as an independent is often kept out of any information loop. Now, this is true in Townsville as well as many other places. And what this means is that Team Hill, in the Townsville context, votes virtually all the time as a block on policy. So I decided to do some checking out. I checked the council minutes for the last 7 months, and of the 153 motions put, 118 of them were unanimous votes, and the rest, that is 33 motions, were still carried, but with dissent from the independents. And then there were 2 motions that were put up by the independents that were also subsequently voted down by the block. Now note this though, of all motions, there were only 2 occasions in 7 months where block councillors voted against the block, and they were only for minor concerns. Now, what does this mean? It means that nothing changes because Team Hill controls both the presenting agenda, and the agenda always progresses unimpeded. Now, somehow, I think we have to change that paradigm. As a strategy, we should identify where we can impact next year's election in March to change partisan council decision making, and I suggest that we could use the 20-minute neighbourhood concept as a driver for that change by informing our local population. Now, the 6th pathway has to do with legislative options that we could pursue to create leverage as well. Now, The freedom of trade and movement in accordance with our national constitution. Section 92 says that trade within the Commonwealth is to be free on the imposition of uniform duties of customs, trade, commerce and intercourse among states, whether by means of internal carriage, ocean navigations or whatever. It shall be absolutely free. So if we can somehow demonstrate that smart cities have the possible intention to limit movement and trade across jurisdictions, then that could be a vote shifter locally. Then there is the inconsistencies of laws aspect of our constitution in section 109, which states when a law of a state is inconsistent with a law of the Commonwealth, the latter shall prevail and the former shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be invalid. Again, if we can demonstrate that aspects of the smart cities or the 20-minute neighbourhoods contravene this law, then we may have pushback at that level as well. As a strategy, we have to create as much leverage as we can to push back against the 20-minute neighbourhood concept for our town. Now, I hope you found this particularly helpful today for your own circumstance. Remember, always be willing to countenance the possibility that your view of reality is an impoverished view. The things that appear are not always as they seem. Thanks for watching. We'll talk again.